Born in 356 BC in Pella, capital of the Kingdom of Macedonia, Alexander inherited a kingdom his father, Philip II, had already transformed into the dominant military power across the broader Greek world, providing Alexander with both the genuinely formidable military foundation and the considerable political ambition. Alexander's education included direct personal tutoring from the philosopher Aristotle, whom Philip specifically engaged to oversee his son's formal education. This provided Alexander with genuine exposure to Greek philosophical, literary, and scientific tradition that historians believe meaningfully shaped his broader intellectual outlook. Philip's own military reforms, including significant tactical innovations involving the Macedonian phalanx formation and combined arms battlefield coordination, provided Alexander with a formidable instrument. He inherited the Macedonian throne following his father's assassination in 336 BC, an event whose precise underlying causes remain subject to historical scholarly discussion. Alexander assumed the Macedonian throne at just 20 years old, quickly moving to secure his political position through decisive military action against various regional challenges. He then turned his military resources toward the ambitious campaign against the Persian Empire that would transform him into the ruler of history's largest empire. Before departing on his eastern campaign, Alexander first secured his authority across mainland Greece itself, including a genuinely decisive military response to rebellion in Thebes. This reflected Alexander's determination to establish unquestioned authority across his base before committing his forces to the extended military campaign against Persia he long intended. In 334 BC, Alexander led his combined Macedonian and Greek military forces across the Hellespont Strait into Persian imperial territory. This began the extraordinary military campaign that would, across the following decade, fundamentally reshape the political map of the ancient world. Alexander's campaign against the Persian Empire, ruled by King Darius III, unfolded through a series of genuinely decisive military engagements, beginning with the Battle of Granicus, followed by the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, where Alexander achieved a victory against larger forces. His success was achieved through superior tactical coordination, and Alexander's own willingness to personally lead decisive cavalry charges at critical moments. Alexander's success reflected tactical sophistication, emphasizing his capability for adapting tactics to specific terrain and enemy dispositions. Effective logistics allowed his forces to campaign across enormous distances and diverse, often challenging geographic and climatic conditions. Alexander proceeded to conquer the eastern Mediterranean coastline, including a difficult extended siege of the fortified city of Tyre. In Egypt, he was welcomed as a liberator and recognized according to Egyptian religious custom, establishing the city of Alexandria. Alexandria would become one of the ancient world's most significant intellectual and cultural centers for many subsequent centuries following its founding. The siege of Tyre represented a remarkable engineering achievement, requiring his forces to construct an extensive causeway connecting the mainland to the island. This undertaking allowed his forces to successfully overcome defenses that had proven resistant to numerous earlier historical siege attempts. Alexander's campaign against Persia reached its decisive culmination at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, where his forces achieved a genuinely historic victory against Darius's considerably larger assembled Persian imperial army. A battle historians studying ancient military history consistently identify as one of history's most significant and tactically impressive ancient military engagements. This decisive victory effectively ended organized Persian imperial resistance, with Darius himself fleeing the battlefield, before subsequently being killed by his own remaining supporters, who apparently hoped, unsuccessfully as events would prove, to use his capture or death as a bargaining position in eventual negotiations with the now clearly dominant Alexander, whose forces subsequently occupied the major Persian imperial capitals, including Babylon and Persepolis, effectively bringing the centuries-old Persian Achaemenid Empire to its definitive historical end. Alexander's occupation of these significant Persian imperial centers involved genuine, notable complexity beyond simple military conquest, with historians noting Alexander's demonstrated interest in incorporating elements of Persian imperial administrative practice, and controversially, among some of his own Macedonian and Greek followers, adopting certain Persian royal customs and court practices, reflecting genuine strategic calculation regarding how best to govern his rapidly expanding, ethnically diverse new empire, rather than simply imposing purely Macedonian and Greek administrative and cultural practice across his newly conquered Persian territories. It is worth noting directly, for historical honesty, that Alexander's campaign, however militarily impressive, involved genuine significant destruction and human cost, including the documented burning of Persepolis's royal palace complex, an event ancient sources describe with somewhat varying accounts and considerable civilian and military casualties across his extended campaign. Historical realities responsible historical treatment must acknowledge honestly, alongside his genuine military and administrative achievements. Rather than consolidating his already historically unprecedented conquests following Persia's defeat, Alexander continued his military campaign considerably further eastward. He pushed into Central Asia and eventually into the Indian subcontinent, reflecting his sustained personal ambition toward continued territorial expansion. Historians studying his psychology and motivation continue examining this drive for conquest that seemed to have no end. Alexander's campaigns through Central Asia, including modern Afghanistan, involved difficult, sustained military engagement against determined local resistance. Historians note this phase proved more prolonged and militarily challenging than his earlier, more decisively concluded confrontations with Persian imperial forces. Alexander's eventual advance into the Indian subcontinent culminated in the significant Battle of the Hydaspes River in 326 BC. They faced the regional ruler Porus, a battle that proved genuinely difficult for Alexander's forces. His troops were particularly unfamiliar with the war elephants Porus's forces employed, creating a scene of immense chaos and power. Though Alexander's forces ultimately achieved victory through tactical adaptability and effective battlefield coordination, the cost was high. Following this victory, however, Alexander's own soldiers reportedly refused to continue marching further eastward. They were exhausted after years of continuous demanding military campaigning across enormous distances. The men were increasingly reluctant to continue Alexander's evidently unlimited territorial ambitions. This forced Alexander, essentially for the first time, to accept his soldiers' collective refusal. He began the long return march back toward the empire's more established western territories. This refusal at the Hyphasis River represents a significant moment, revealing the practical limits of even Alexander's considerable personal authority. His veteran soldiers had endured roughly 8 years of continuous campaigning, far from their original Macedonian and Greek homes. It reflects the genuine human limits to military endurance that even Alexander's remarkable leadership could not entirely overcome. Beyond his remarkable military conquests, Alexander demonstrated genuine interest in the practical administrative challenge of governing his enormous, ethnically and culturally diverse new empire. He employed several notable strategies that historians studying ancient imperial administration consider genuinely significant, moving far beyond simple military conquest alone. Alexander founded numerous new cities throughout his conquered territories, many bearing his own name, including most famously Alexandria in Egypt. These cities were generally intended to serve as administrative, commercial, and cultural centers, helping integrate newly conquered territories into his broader empire. They also facilitated the spread of Greek language, culture, and administrative practice throughout these diverse regions, a process historians refer to as Hellenization. This represents one of Alexander's most historically significant and enduring legacies, extending well beyond his own relatively brief personal lifetime. Alexander also pursued deliberate policies encouraging cultural integration between his Macedonian and Greek followers and various conquered populations. This included arranging mass marriages between his own senior officers and Persian noblewomen during a significant ceremony at Susa. This reflected a strategic calculation regarding long-term imperial administrative integration. However, historians note this policy proved controversial among many of his Macedonian followers and did not persist as established practice following Alexander's death. This combination of conquest, urban foundation, and cultural policy reflects Alexander's ambition toward constructing a genuinely lasting, integrated multicultural empire. But his unexpectedly early death would ultimately prevent him from fully completing this project or securing it through adequate succession planning. Alexander also supported scientific and geographic knowledge expansion, bringing scholars along with his military forces to document and study the regions. This contributed genuinely valuable new knowledge to broader Greek understanding, significantly expanding contemporary awareness of the wider world. Alexander died in Babylon in June 323 BC, at just 32 years old, following a rapid illness whose exact specific cause remains, despite extensive historical and medical investigation, a genuinely unresolved historical mystery that continues generating active scholarly discussion and competing proposed explanations. Ancient historical sources describe Alexander experiencing a rapid onset of severe illness, including high fever, and according to various accounts, significant physical weakness that progressed over approximately 10 to 12 days before his death, with ancient sources offering varying details regarding his symptoms and their precise progression, reflecting the inherent difficulty of establishing precise modern medical diagnosis from these ancient descriptive accounts alone. Modern historians and medical researchers have proposed numerous competing theories, including infectious diseases such as typhoid fever or malaria, and even poisoning. Ancient sources speculated about poisoning, given Alexander's numerous political rivals, and the significant succession implications his death would immediately create. More recently, some medical researchers have proposed conditions including Guillain-Barré syndrome as potentially consistent with the described symptom progression. However, no single theory has achieved definitive confirmation, meaning Alexander's actual cause of death remains a genuinely unresolved historical and medical mystery. Alexander's death created an immediate political crisis, since he had failed to clearly designate an adult successor capable of assuming control over his enormous empire, setting in motion the extended, genuinely destructive succession conflicts this documentary's next section will examine. Alexander's sudden, unexpected death without a clearly established adult successor precipitated an extended period of genuinely severe political conflict among his surviving senior military commanders. Historians refer to collectively as the Wars of the Diadochi, or successors, extending across several subsequent decades following Alexander's own death. Alexander's infant son, born to his wife Roxana shortly after his own death, along with his half-brother Philip Aridaeus, whose own capacity for effective independent rule ancient sources suggest was genuinely limited, provided only nominal, largely symbolic royal succession claims that Alexander's various powerful military commanders used as convenient political justification for their own competing practical claims to control over different portions of the empire, rather than genuinely intending to preserve unified imperial rule under these largely powerless nominal royal successors. This extended succession conflict ultimately resulted in Alexander's enormous empire fragmenting into several separate competing successor kingdoms, including notably the Ptolemaic dynasty that would eventually rule Egypt, discussed extensively in this documentary series' previous examination of Cleopatra, along with the Seleucid Empire controlling much of the former Persian imperial territory, and the Antigonid dynasty eventually controlling Macedonia itself, representing a genuinely significant fragmentation of Alexander's original unified conquest into these separate, often mutually competing successor political entities. This fragmentation reflects a significant historical irony. Alexander's remarkable military conquest ultimately proved considerably less durable as a unified political entity then the various separate successor kingdoms that eventually emerged from its extended, genuinely destructive post-mortem fragmentation across these subsequent decades. Alexander's own wife Roxana and their infant son ultimately met genuinely tragic fates. Amid this extended succession conflict, both reportedly killed years after Alexander's death, to eliminate any remaining direct claim to Alexander's original unified imperial authority. A sobering historical postscript illustrating the severe, sustained political violence this extended succession conflict produced across the decades. Understanding Alexander accurately requires directly addressing how his historical image began transforming into legendary narrative. This transformation into mythical storytelling began even within a relatively short period following his actual historical death. Historians trace this subsequent historical reputation across many following centuries of continued literary and cultural elaboration. The so-called Alexander Romance tradition is an extensive body of legendary literature, developing across subsequent centuries. It incorporated increasingly elaborate, historically unverifiable, fantastical elements into popular retellings of his life and campaigns. These included various supernatural encounters and exaggerated conquests extending well beyond his actual historical territorial achievements. This reflects broader ancient and medieval literary patterns of mythologizing historically significant figures. Historians note this occurred across numerous different ancient and medieval cultures and historical traditions. Separating this later legendary elaboration from Alexander's documented achievements requires careful reliance on grounded ancient sources. Notably, the historian Arrian drew upon earlier, more contemporary historical accounts, including those of Alexander's own companion Ptolemy. Ptolemy would himself later become the founding ruler of Egypt's Ptolemaic dynasty, providing material considered more historically reliable. Historians emphasize that even these sources require critical evaluation, as they were often composed with particular political perspectives. Personal perspectives potentially shaped their specific presentation and interpretation of Alexander's actual historical actions and character. This reflects the significant historical challenge of establishing reliable understanding of any ancient figure. The contemporary historical record remains considerably more limited than the evidence available for more recent historical periods. Responsible historical treatment of Alexander's remarkable military achievements requires directly acknowledging the genuine, significant human cost his relentless military campaigns imposed. This cost was felt by the populations he conquered and his own soldiers who sustained years of continuous campaigning across enormous geographic distances. Ancient sources describe numerous instances of significant civilian casualties and city destruction connected to Alexander's military campaigns. Notably, the destruction of Thebes early in his reign was intended as a deliberate demonstration of the severe consequences facing Greek cities that resisted. The destruction of Persepolis's royal palace complex represented a genuine human and cultural cost that responsible historical treatment must acknowledge honestly. We must avoid presenting his campaigns purely as celebrated military triumph without appropriate corresponding acknowledgement of their genuine destructive consequences. Alexander's own soldiers sustained genuinely severe hardship across years of continuous military campaigning, including casualties from combat, disease, and environmental challenges. His forces encountered particularly difficult phases, including a notably disastrous crossing of the Gedrosian Desert during his return march from India. Ancient sources describe severe losses among both his military forces and civilian personnel, from starvation, dehydration, and general environmental exposure. This genuine human cost represents an essential component of understanding his full historical legacy honestly. Appropriate recognition of his achievements must not inadvertently minimize the substantial human suffering his sustained, relentless military ambition required. All this occurred across his remarkable but genuinely costly decade of continuous conquest. More than 2,300 years after his death, Alexander's historical legacy remains genuinely significant and, appropriately, genuinely complex, encompassing both remarkable historically unprecedented military and administrative achievement, and substantial, well-documented human cost, that responsible historical understanding must hold together honestly, rather than favoring either simplified celebration or simplified condemnation alone. Alexander's campaigns produced genuinely lasting historical consequences, extending well beyond his own relatively brief personal lifetime, including the significant spread of Greek language, culture, and administrative practice throughout the broader Middle Eastern and Central Asian world during the subsequent Hellenistic period, creating lasting cultural and commercial connections between the Mediterranean world and considerably more distant regions that would continue shaping regional history for many centuries following his own death. The successor kingdoms that emerged from his empire's fragmentation, including notably the Ptolemaic dynasty, this documentary series has previously examined through Cleopatra's own reign centuries later, maintained and further developed various aspects of this broader Hellenistic cultural and political legacy, reflecting Alexander's genuine, lasting historical significance, extending considerably beyond his own personal military campaigns into the broader subsequent historical development of the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world across several following centuries. Alexander the Great, understood honestly rather than through either simplified legendary celebration or simplified historical condemnation, remains a genuinely significant figure. A remarkable military commander and administrator whose relentless ambition reshaped the ancient world's political map within barely a decade of continuous campaigning, achieved through genuine tactical brilliance and administrative innovation, but also through substantial, well-documented human cost that his historically unprecedented conquests required at every stage of their remarkable, ultimately unfinished progression.